is in an existential crisis, with war on the continent, an unpredictable US and potential trade tariffs along the way. For the Europe Conversation, I catch up with former head of the WTO, Pascal Lamy. He says the EU should negotiate rather than retaliate, but with a gun in its pocket. Pascal Lamy, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation. I'm going to start with you to ask you about, your impression of the world we're in now. Now that Donald Trump is back in the White House, that there seems to be a backlash against globalization, against free trade, against basic policies, in relation to civil rights and so on. How do you feel the world is right now?
It's in bad shape, and in a much worse shape than the world I've been living with and working with for many years of my life. So I'm getting old, and I'm worried that, let's say, for the last 5 to 10 years, the system we had, which was far from perfect, but still had a number of benefits in harnessing globalization and regulating a number of possible problems. A lot of that is disappearing, starting, of course, with the invasion of Ukraine, which is just sitting on any principle of international law. And now the US want to overhaul the system. To do what? Unclear. But they both say this system is not good for us and we need to use the power we have to change it. And this, of course, puts the EU, which is the epitome of a regulated, disciplined, ordo-liberalist system, in a bind. And I'm worried about the world, but I'm very much worried about whether the EU, as the future of my children and grandchildren, will be able to overcome this challenge, which, in my view, is existential.
And how would you think that the EU needs to respond now? Does it need to just wait and see what Trump does? And if there are tariffs, should the EU respond accordingly?
Now, the first thing the EU should do, and has done, is get prepared. They've been thinking about that for months. I mean, the notion that Trump would be president of the US appeared, unfortunately, in my view, quite some time ago. So then the big question is retaliate or negotiate. There are things the US want from us, and there are things we want from the US.
Such as?
Other than being shot at. So there is a range of issues where we probably could open an interesting transatlantic negotiation. So that's the case for wait and see, and say, which EU authorities have been saying, we're ready to look at a deal.
So what kind of deals, what are you talking about specifically that we would negotiate with, that we have, in our armament?
I mean, for instance, take the example of cars. He's got a crappy argument and he's got a reasonable argument. The crappy argument is, Angela, there are plenty of Mercedes in New York, 0 Chevron in Berlin. This is a problem. As long as there won't be an equal number of Chevrons in Berlin, this is a problem. Stupid thing. Where he's right is that the EU has an import tariff of 10%, and the US have an import tariff for cars at 3%. Now, is it the reason why there is no Chevron in Berlin? No way, but
it exists.
It exists. So maybe we could accept 5 or 6 or 7 or 8% tariff in the US if they accept to lower their tariff on things which we would like to export more in the US and which are not in his mind as a big problem. Or maybe we could negotiate that against something to be done in NATO that the US don't want to do, but that we want to do. So there are plenty of things. Now, of course, and that's my experience of negotiating with the US and China and other big shots when I was in this business, you should do that with a gun in your pocket. If you negotiate with the mafia, you may have to, but you need a gun in your pocket. You need to show your strength and say, ready to deal. But if the deal does not work, if you believe you will debalance the deal just because you are threatening us, we have the means to retaliate, which is true because we have a large market and US exporters of a number of products will have problems if we retaliate.
Where did it all go wrong? I mean, do you understand the backlash against globalization?
I've always said, and you and others always heard me saying, that globalization is here to stay, not least because 3/4 at least of the people of this planet like globalization because they see it as a better future for them because they are poor. And second, so it's here to stay, but in a different shape. But the world will not deglobalize. Now, what I've always said is globalization is efficient and painful, and it is efficient because it is painful, and it is painful because it is efficient. If I do something better than you do, and you do something better than I do, it's a win-win.
And speaking of shocks from outside, you have Elon Musk, who's basically in the White House now, saying that he's interfering in UK politics, but also German politics. Do you think European politics can stay the course to protect itself?
I mean, we have to. At the end of the day, we've mentioned the environment, we've mentioned trade, at the end of the day, what matters is values.
And are those values being diminished?
They are European values.
But are they being diminished by the rise to the right?
Of course they have been diminished. I mean, democracy has receded by, let's say, 15 or 20% for the last 20 years. The biggest danger, when I discuss with my American friends who don't like Trump, and I have more of that in my sample, understandably, European Social Democrats are flabbergasted at Trump, although we try to understand. What they tell me is that the real danger is if the roots of American democracy are rotten. Corruption, I've been working with Transparency International, who's the main international organization fighting against corruption for 35 years now. Corruption is a terrible destruction of democracy.
Just before I let you go, the Mercosur trade deal, which has been sort of on the table for decades, pretty much, your own country, France, is really dead against it. So are other countries, but France is really leading the charge. What do you think France should do in relation to Mercosur? Can you understand the French farmers and agricultural industry?
No, I mean, I can understand part of why French farmers are unhappy. And I do understand why they are unhappy. But what I know is that the reasons they have to be unhappy has nothing to do with Europe or Mercosur. They have to do with the way the French have handled the common agricultural policy within France. So for the French farmers who are angry, and I can understand why some of them are angry, not all, some of them are doing pretty well. But
like the smaller farmers are angry.
The smaller farmers have good reason to be angry, but it's not because of Europe. Europe has always helped them. It's not because of Mercosur. It's because of the way the French have interpreted, translated, implemented a number of, for instance, precautionary regulation coming from Brussels. So the Mercosur plays the role of a scapegoat.
But, I mean, it's not just the French farmers. Farmers across Europe would say that they are producing to a particularly high standard,
Yeah.
but then what they'll have to endure is beef and agricultural products coming into their market that is produced at a much lower standard, so
This is
therefore
wrong.
cheaper. Okay.
This is wrong. There is no chicken that enters the EU market if this chicken does not follow the same regulatory phytosanitary standards as the one which are implemented in Europe. So this notion that importing food is displacing nationally produced food because it's lower quality, sanitary and phytosanitary. I'm not talking about the quality of the food itself.
Yeah, of course, you're talking about the production standards.
This argument that we are the victims of low standard imports is wrong. Simply wrong. It just doesn't, it's not the fact. But that's the way they paint it. That's the way some of them feel it.
They also feel that the checks aren't there. So even if they have to apply the standards in Mercosur countries, they won't be applied properly. And therefore there'll be a loophole.
But that's another story. The checks are for everybody. And we do import quite a lot from Mercosur today. So if we have a Czech problem, let's solve the Czech problem.
Okay.
But it's not in importing a bit more from Mercosur in order to export quite more to Mercosur that the Czech problem will be changed. I do agree that we may have a Czech problem. But if we have it, let's solve it. Nothing to do with Mercosur.
Okay, well, Pascal Lamy, thank you very much for joining us on the
My pleasure.
Conversation.